So really nice to see our folks here live. There is food for you. I've got some bad news for you people online. We couldn't get the delivery service working, but it's really nice to have you here anyway, joining us. So my name's Darren. I think I know most people, and I'm the director of the Lifestyle Medicine and Health Research Centre, which is one of our three key research centres at Avondale University. And today we've titled this Mood Lifting Research. Now, I recall, this is going back some time now, this is going to show my age, probably was 1995 or 96. And Daniel Wren, I was thinking about starting my PhD, and Daniel, if he's there online, he won't remember this, but he said to me, I was asking about this PhD thing, and he said, well, my PhD was more pleasure than pain. And I thought, I'm going to tuck that away. And that's my goal, to make my PhD more pleasure than pain. And I think I achieved that. I actually got a lot of joy out of it. And in fact, the whole research space, it's a really cool space to belong to. So it can be mood lifting in its own rights. Right? That's my point here. However, we're not going to talk about the lift that maybe your research provides you. What we're really focused in on this particular session is some of the work that we're doing within the research centre, which is really focused on mental health and wellbeing. And we're going to be hearing from two presenters. Firstly, I'll be sharing some information on some of the work that I've been leading. And then we have one of our PhD candidates, Mark, who I think you're going to find really fascinating, the work that he's doing. Mark's a psychologist. I'll say a few more words about him before he kicks it off. But I'll go for about 20 minutes. He'll do about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for some questions at the end. Does that sound good? Everyone's nodding here. You guys online, we can still see you, so you have to nod along as well. So let me just share a little bit about, I'm in the lifestyle medicine space, and lifestyle medicine really is about treating the cause of many of the conditions that we suffer and die from today. And to my mind, this isn't rocket science. We know that, with chronic conditions, for many of them, the root cause is actually lifestyle. And so what it makes sense is, instead of trying to put Band-Aids on them, waiting for people to fall off the edge of the cliff and do something about it, what we need to be doing is helping people to shuffle further away from the edge of the cliff up the top. And so lifestyle medicine has really been focused on the use of lifestyle-based therapies, predominantly non-pharmacological based therapies, to help people with their chronic conditions. And what it turns out is, as we're about to discover, is what's good for your body is also exceptionally good for your brain. And so lifestyle medicine is not just good for physical health, it's actually really good for mental health as well. I've been involved in the lifestyle medicine space for a long time now. And I think the research narrative has changed, at least from my perspective. I think in the early stages, going back sort of 10, 15 years ago, really the emphasis was on trying to present evidence that this stuff works, right? That actually getting people to eat healthier and to move better and to get outdoors and manage their stress, that this can actually be really effective for helping to manage and treat chronic conditions, including mental health conditions. And I think there was just so much pushback, literally, and I know a lot of the pioneers in the lifestyle medicine space, sort of globally, who have been at this game for longer than I have, for 25, 30 years. And what's interesting, they just talk about, it feels like that the wind has been in our face the whole time. It's just hard work. People are saying it just doesn't work. Nah, it's no good. No. Show us the evidence. And so a lot of the research focus, sort of in the early stages, was just to demonstrate that these things work, right? That these things can actually be effective. But what I think has, this is probably my greater interest, is there's this pivot now towards recognise that the evidence is overwhelming. We know that this stuff works. We know that, for example, even exercise is probably one of the most powerful and yet least utilised antidepressants we have available to us. Nutrition is incredibly powerful for managing and reversing things like diabetes. So we know it works, but the bigger question now, and this is what I'm really intrigued in, how do we make it work best, right? And how can we even get people to get excited about this, which is perhaps even a greater challenge in its own right. And so I think that with that, then all of a sudden there comes a whole lot of questions that need to be asked. If we're interested in how do we maximize the impact of this? How can we do the most good with this? And that starts to bring to the fore questions like, what about online delivery? What about different settings in which we provide these, whether it be workplaces or education, school settings, or in healthcare settings. Who does it work best for? What's the age, gender, different demographics? What can we learn about, if we're running programs, the facilitator, how do they contribute to the outcomes? So really my key focus, which is what at least gets me excited and gives me a mood lift, is trying to strategize and think, how can we now take these learnings that we have, evidence that these things work, but actually present them in a way that have the biggest impact. And so really what we've created over a number of years now is a model for doing that. And what that model looks like is a program. So we created an intervention. I know that I won't bore you with the details because I know that many of you have heard this before, but created this LIFT project, which is it's a multidisciplinary sort of a multimodal. It touches on all of the things we know that can actually help. It's focused on mental health and wellbeing, by the way, but has all of these elements, these evidence-based strategies that we know can help to lift people's moods and their lives, and bring them all together, right? So it's interdisciplinary. We wanted to try something different, and that is that often when we talk about mental health, and even when I say those words, if I played a word association game with you, probably the first words that spring to your mind are depression and anxiety, right? Which is not really mental health at all. It's actually mental ill health. And so what we wanted to do, and what that means is that when people talk about participating in a mental health program, there's stigma attached to that. And many people, I think we're getting better at this, but for a long time, people didn't want to put up their hand and say, hey, I need some help. And so we wanted to create something that was pitched in a positive way, right? That wasn't really about psychoanalysis. It was just about pointing people to science-based strategies that could, help them to feel better and feel better about life. And then the last thing is we wanted to make it educational, because I'm a big believer in education. And I know that there are critics that say that, education doesn't work because the world is full of people who know what to do, but just don't do what they know. But education does work when it changes people's attitudes, because attitudes drive the way that we think, feel, and do. And so we wanted to create this educational program. So we came up with this. It's a 10 sort of part initiative. I call it an educational adventure, and people explore all of these evidence-based ways that we know can actually help support their mental well-being, including, and I'll highlight that number 3 there is called Blue and Green Should Often Be Seen, because Mark, our next presenter, he'll be talking about that. He has a great interest and is an expert in the space of nature and just getting people outdoors, why that can be so therapeutic. So it's this 10-part program. We really tried to apply the best pedagogy to this. So the pedagogical framework that we use for the LIFT project can be summed up as LETS, L-E-T-S. It's meant to be inviting. It's all pitched around a challenge by choice. But what people pretty much do, according to the LETS framework, is they learn some stuff in a fun way. They learn the science. Then we give them some experiences, the E, so that they try it for themselves. Then we get them to think about how that worked for them. And we know that reflection is a really key, important part of education. And then S is for share. And I'm a big believer that the best way to learn anything is to teach it, because it becomes part of who you are. And so that's the educational framework. In the program, we catered for different learning styles, so people could watch a video presentation, or they could listen to audio, or they could read about it, because people learn in different ways. So we really tried to put all of the best practice that we knew from an educational perspective and from what the science says about could be used to lift people's lives. And then we had to start with a start. And I said that there's this sort of change in this research narrative from does this work to how do we make this work best? And this is really where my greater interest lies. But you have to do the early work, first of all, to see, does it actually work? And so we've published a number of papers. They've got about a dozen publications now that have emerged from this. And unremarkably, because once again, we know that exercise is powerful modulator of mental health. We know that food feeds your mood. We actually know that Deakin University, Felice Jacka, has the whole food mood clinic. So we know that there's relationships there. So it's not like we've done anything super creative other than just pull all of the things we already know work into a one-stop shop. And so unremarkably, when we run randomized control like this, we actually, so this was quite a large program. This is one of our PhD students, Geraldine Prisbinko. But we had about, I think there was nearly 200 people in each arm of this study, delivered it online. And what we see is very significant improvements in the positive attributes of mental health. So things like overall mental wellbeing scores, vitality, energy levels, life satisfaction. So these are all positive and somewhat anticipated outcomes. There's another construct within the positive psychology literature, which is called flourishing. And this is the whole idea of living life really well. And it's a sort of a validated construct, this whole idea of not just getting by, not languishing or just sort of being okay, but this is sort of the higher order of doing better than okay. And probably only about 1 in 5 people would report that they're flourishing at any one time. But what we saw is when people do engage with a program like this, an educational program like this, we see significant increases in that. And what's interesting is that when we follow them up 3 months later, they're still reporting significant improvements and outcomes from it. So that's great, good news. However, this is what started to intrigue me when we're looking at this data from we did a fairly large RCT and then a randomized comparative study. Is that not only was it promoting the positive, and remember it's a positively orientated program, and one of the nice things about having a positively orientated program is there's no stigma attached to being part of it. And even the name we were a bit selective with, like the LIFT projects, right? I don't care if you're an 8 out of 10, you'd probably like to be a 9 out of 10. And so it's something for everyone. There's no barriers to engagement. But what we noticed is that this was actually relieving negative effects as well. So it was promoting the positive, but it was also negating the negative. And that intrigued me greatly because that potentially then presents a new paradigm for doing mental health promotion, mental wellbeing promotion. And so we saw, significant reductions in things like depressive symptoms, anxiety and stress. And then we actually noticed also is that the people that were getting the biggest shifts in their mental wellbeing scores, mental health scores, were those that were lowest on the mental health ladder, which somewhat is unremarkable because you've got more room to move there. But once again, this speaks to the idea that this potentially is a new paradigm for doing mental health promotion. And so I actually thought, what about if we took this further? What about, because we're generally just targeting the general population, what about if we actually targeted people that were really struggling? And so we had a master's student last year, Amanda, and she was based in South Africa, really quite a challenged community. And her husband was a local GP there. We said, what about if we ran this in a clinical setting? So a face-to-face setting where people come along and engage in that way. So we did this study and we published this a little bit early this year in Frontiers in Psychology. And what's quite amazing is that we had about 25, a pilot study, had about 25 people, all on antidepressant medications, all with diagnoses of depression or anxiety. And what we saw literally within 3 weeks, they had reported significant improvements in their mental health metrics and their levels of energy and vitality. And look, there's a lot that could be said about that. Was it just, that they were doing something? They had some hope, and I think there's part of that. But what we saw is that there was, there's obviously a plateauing effect. But what this spoke to once again is that even in a clinical setting, amongst those who have the greatest needs, a positively approached, presented program like this could actually be helpful. And so we've extended. I have a great interest. This really is what I am really, really keen to see happen. And we've actually got 2 programs now that are running, 2 studies that have been conducted. One is here in Donnybrook, and this is another one of our master's students in the lifestyle medicine program. Vitska is a GP. She owns her own clinic in Donnybrook in Western Australia. And what she's reporting, like many other GPs, are saying is that, we are inundated with mental distress patients. And we don't know what to do about it. We're actually getting, obviously they can offer medication, but often it's 3 to 5 month wait before we can actually get to, them in to see a psychologist with follow-up psychological services. As a GP, I don't feel good about the level of care I'm providing. It's almost like I'm sending people into the abyss, like, well, hang in there, for the next 3 to 5 months. And so we came up with this strategy. We said, what about if you could say to a patient who you thought, might benefit, hey, you know what? In the meantime, in the interim, there is a program that's been shown to be beneficial, and it's an educational program. It's an educational adventure. Would you be interested in me registering you for that? And so this is the model. And so she can, all of her GPs at a clinic can invite the person. And then if they are agreeable, they get registered. They walk out of the clinic with the program kicked off, and it will be drip fed to them over a 10-week period. Once every week or fortnight at the clinic, they offer a shared medical meetup. And so people can just come along and chat about what they're learning and what they're doing. And so we actually just, we're just in the process of writing this up for Australian Family Physician. But have I got the results? What's been really interesting is that over the course of the couple of months that we ran the trial, had about 150, I think. I was analysing the data this morning, so it should be fresh in my mind, but had about 150 people that said they'd like to participate in that. And then what we can see is, and this is one thing I'm really interested in, is what sort of levels of engagement do we get from that? And if people are just offered an initiative like this, to what extent do they, what is their sort of, attrition? And so what we can actually see when we look at website metadata is how many people are visiting the lessons over this 10-week period. And this is the kind of thing you can see. So there's always a drop-off, and that's to be anticipated. But we've actually been really quite surprised at how resilient it's been over the course of, you get quite a bit of drop-off in the first couple of weeks, but then there's the retention is quite nice. So we're in the process of writing it up. We have another identical program being conducted at the moment in New York State in what they call a federally qualified health centre over there. And we're seeing pretty similar outcomes. So I'm really passionate about this. I think that this is a way that we can address that waitlist gap that is just escalating all around the world. So there's, this big question, how do we make this work best? Is it in clinical settings like that? Is it through developing models whereby GPs can provide it? Or should we actually target the GPs in their own right? Because you know what, within the carers need some caring for. And so we tried this model too. So last year, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, we said, as an organisation, could we offer the LIFT project to all of your members? And so they have about 7,000 members over there. We had we have more than that, about 1,700 of them registered for the program. And then we're able to watch what happens. So we actually wrote this up. This was published earlier this year, once again, in the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine. But, really positive feedback. And once again, I'm always interested in what's this attrition? These are busy people now. What happens to them? What sort of, retention do we get throughout a program like this? And in fact, this is almost becoming one of my key metrics of interest. How do we retain people? How do we keep them going? And they offered various different initiatives. They had a connect group that people could be part of. And they sometimes have actually run Facebook closed groups where people can connect and communicate. Sometimes there might be Zoom meetups. Sometimes it can even be face-to-face meetups. But there's a whole lot of learnings taking place into, how do we get people to engage with this stuff to make it work best? We've actually got, this is very cool, on next Sunday, October 8, with the Hunter New England Central Coast Primary Health Network are offering it to all GPs and allied health professionals throughout the network, all the way up to the Queensland border. So it's been really interesting working with them. And once again, they have a key interest in this space of caring for the carers. So anyway, I just got the update as I was driving up here. I got Tish I said, how are we going? So there's about 300 GPs that have signed up for this program, which will kick off in next Sunday. And then there's this other idea that I've got. I'm always thinking big, and I'm maybe too big at times, but what about if we actually just did this on scale? What about if we actually started to offer a program, an initiative like this as a community development initiative to entire communities? And so we've done several of these now. I need to wrap up, but we've run it on the Sunshine Coast. We've literally had 6,000 people register for the program. We ran it in Lake Macquarie City Council, where we've had several thousand people do it there. This one here is really intriguing. We're presenting this at the American College of Lifestyle Medicine conference in a couple of weeks' time. Mal will be doing this one. But in the one program in New York State, within a certain community, we had over 5,000 people in the one hit. And we actually got about 1,000 sort of open-ended responses in terms of feedback on that. And so it's teaching us about, hey, what do people like? What do people like? What factors could contribute to them actually being engaged, following through? So we're learning a whole lot about that at the moment. Actually, this Sunday too, in the Northern Rivers area, the 7 councils, all flood-affected areas, they're going to be offering it to all of their residents. That's sponsored by ADRA. which would be a great thing too. I might tell you, I've got a crazy idea that I've actually got at Woolworths head office 50 of their key staff doing the LIFT project, because I want Woolworths to offer it as a nationwide initiative. I think too big. Anyway, so here's my thing. I think this whole lifestyle medicine space, the narrative to my mind is changing from, does it work? It works, but how do we make it work best? How do we optimize and maximize its impact? And that's really the space. And with that comes a whole lot of research questions that keep me laying awake at night in bed. But, exploring things like, what about online and face-to-face? How does that work? Mel, in her PhD program, that was one thing she examined. And what we know is that for some people, online delivery works really well, right? It's and possibly more introverted people. Some people actually really need the face-to-face stuff, So who are those people? How do we move them in directions that will help them the most? What are these age, gender? We know historically, with any wellbeing program, even with stuff I've done in the area of diabetes and heart disease, generally there's always a female bias to who will engage with these sorts of programs. So how do we engage men more? Right? What does that look like? What do they like? What makes it more appealing for them? Different settings. If we really want to get great impact, are workplaces the way to do that? Right? Because workplaces can actually require people to do things. And one of my learnings over all the years I've been in this space is that for people to engage in a wellbeing initiative, generally they need to be either A, desperate and looking for solutions, or B, forced to do it, or highly incentivized to do it in some way. Workplaces offer the opportunity to do that, particularly if you can couple it to continuing education points or personal development initiatives. In schools, right, our kids need to know this stuff. Is that we've got Barker College here. They've actually been running the LIFT project. They've adopted as their wellbeing framework for this year, and they're going to be doing it over the next couple of years as well. Is that a channel that we can have great impact? Healthcare settings, communities, these large-scale community initiatives. What design features should we put in programs to engage people better? And then these facilitators, if we can run groups, what does a good facilitator look like? What training do they need? Who do they connect best with? So there are just so many questions. As you go on, you start to think, oh, I'm learning stuff. This is great. And then you go, oh no, there's so much more to learn. But it's exciting and it's mood lifting if you approach it in the right way. So anyway, I'll finish there because I don't want to steal the time from our next presenter. I was the warm-up act. Next we have Mark Mathieson. Mark has just joined us as a PhD student, and he's actually being supervised by Jason Morton, my brother, and Mel Renfrew, and then I'm part of the team as well. And from day one, when we first met, Jason and Mel have had several chats going, I'm loving this. This is like every time I come to our meetings, I just learn some new things. And so I know this is really quite early in his candidature, but I said to Mark, hey, you know what, would you be willing to present on this topic? And he's very well versed in it. He's been in this space for a long time now. Maybe I'll let Mark say a few more words about himself, but I'm sure you're going to appreciate this. I'll leave it there. So Mark, are you good to go, man? Let me see if I can stop sharing my screen.
That's it.
And how are you going, Kirsty, if you can do that?
How are we going? Can you see?
All right, that's good.
Slide?
Yes, and we can hear you. The people online, can you hear too?
Everyone's looking okay if I talk. Yep, fantastic.
All right, thank you. Take it away.
Thanks, Darren. And look, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are on our beautiful planet. Coming to you from a little place called Tamanick, which is in northeastern Victoria, up in the high country. We've got rain today, so I would love to be outdoors, but I'm stuck inside talking to you folks. I'll try and make it uplifting and interesting, and also not destroy my potential candidature at Avondale at the same time. Somewhere in the audience may just be an invigilator or a potential supervisor or researcher that might take my candidature away from me if I speak too much out of school. So hopefully you'll forgive me. I'll also ask you to forgive me for any grammar or spelling mistakes in this presentation. Attention to detail is unfortunately not my thing either. I'm a bit of a big picture, blue sky dreaming type of person as well. So What I'm going to talk to you today is a little bit about eco-psychology research and how we're aiming to show how developing this concept of what we call an ecological self results in enhanced movement functioning. And I've just put in there in no pun intended, and just possibly save the planet at the same time, because there's no doubt that sitting underneath part of this PhD for certainly myself and I guess other people as well is the fact that, you know, we are certainly in a time where environmental issues, sustainability, regeneration are critical. And if we are possibly going to move towards a view where we view ourselves as an ecological self, as part of the broader ecosystem, not separate from it, then of course, those two things are intertwined inherently. A little bit about me, just very quickly. Look, I've been a psychologist for a long time now. I actually started out as a sports psychologist, which is probably where the link to Darren and lifestyle medicine and other things sort of is most obvious. Worked in special forces in the military, worked in elite sport at the AIS, worked in the corporate sector with some big companies. And over that period of time, worked with lots and lots of people who are all obviously striving to perform at their best, whether that be physically in the case of sport, corporately or financially in the case of business, and certainly in the military in terms of performing those sort of military functions. And I kept seeing the same pattern over and over again, which is that quite often these people are fantastic at a very unique, small niche set of skills and very unsustainable in many other areas of their life. So that sort of raised this question of, well, it seems to be an incomplete model. Most of Western psychology seems to be incomplete. It seems to focus on sort of limited acute performance outcomes and not on the long-term chronic good health outcomes, which I guess is really what lifestyle medicine is often about. It's about how do we sustain people and get them to flourish long-term, not just in the short term. And there's a couple of, I guess, underlying assumptions that I'm working from, which I thought I'd state up front. And they are quite simply that humans are not separate from nature. We are part of fundamentally nature. We've evolved with the rest of the biosphere, and we really are not disconnected at all from those ecological systems. Psychologically, we've become disconnected for a whole bunch of reasons, which I could bore you with. But ostensibly, we see ourselves quite often as separate from nature and being able to control nature. And really, the only way that I can think of from the research that I've been doing over the last 10 years for us to function in a healthy sense is if we see ourselves as an ecological being. So part of that ecosystem in every sense of the word, not just psychologically, but biophysically, chemically, metaphysically, quantum physics. And if we sort of put that model at the center of our thinking, then most of the current models of health are incomplete. They're really dealing with short-term acute issues. They're reactive. They don't take an ecological or an ecosystems view of how we interact with the ecosystems around us and how they interact with us. And so we're only ever putting Band-Aids on the solutions, as Darren kind of alluded to. And so they actually contribute to perpetuating poor health models and this disconnection from the ecosystem around us, and dare I say it, at a community or social level, a broader sense of pathology. So really, we could argue that humanity is a bit sick at the moment, and that's not just a metaphor for the fact that the planet's a bit sick, but those two things are actually the same thing. Destroying the planet around us, and in doing so, we're destroying ourselves and creating all sorts of pathologies as well. So what is this thing called an ecological self? And there's a philosopher, a Norwegian philosopher by the name of Arne Næss. He talks about an ecological self as a position that you arrive at when you see yourself as interwoven with the rest of life. So and I've added the little caveat there that when we think of ourselves as not stopping at the layer of our skin, so the concept of a self doesn't stop at the layer of our skin. In fact, we interact with the environment around us in all sorts of different ways. Then we start to move towards viewing health from an ecological system. So an egoic version of self, the traditional Western model of an ego, tends to say that we only become environmentally responsible, as in we care for the planet, as a form of altruism. So we think of the rest of nature as separate from us, and if we do good things for nature, well, it's because we're good people. It doesn't really directly impact on us. Whereas an ecological self view tends to say that, well, if I'm interested in saving the planet, I'm actually interested in saving myself, because I need that air to breathe and I need the water to be clean so that I can consume it. I need my foods to be organic and free of pesticides and chemicals and toxic, because it actually helps me. And in synchronicity, I can then help the planet. And so we're actually helping each other, albeit that we're actually one and the same thing. So how do we develop that is really the question that my research is focused around. How do we get move people from an egoic view of self to an ecological view of self in a way that I guess doesn't threaten too much of their worldview, and ultimately is both good for them in terms of human flourishing, but also ultimately good for the planet as well. And I thought one of the ways we could talk about that is just to take one element of that interaction, of that connection, and let's talk hypothetically about a research project that we might decide to do one day. And that research project is on sunlight, as an example. So what are the elements of sunlight that interact with us, and how might they influence, our health? So let's assume we have an animal, and we decide that that animal is going to be part of our research project. That animal has photoreceptors in its eye and on its skin that are triggered by sunlight. And as a result of that interaction, it releases certain hormones into its system that regulate its circadian clock and regulate its mitochondrial function and regulate its moods, and also interact with things like its gut microbiome. So we look at that animal, we decide to put it in a dark room, and we keep it there for the majority of the day. We introduce artificial sunlight, which operates in the form of an electric light. Let's just assume it's an LED or a fluorescent light. So the wavelengths of that light tend to mimic what most of us would experience during around midday when we're outdoors. And we turn that light on at sort of 6 o'clock in the morning, and we turn it off at about 10 o'clock at night. And so what that animal experiences over the course of that 10 hours is it's midday all the time. As far as its biological functioning is concerned, it feels like, or it's reacting from a hormonal sense, that it's midday from the moment it wakes up until the moment it tries to go to sleep. Now, we know that photoreceptors in its eye tend to trigger hormone releases. And one of the ones that blue light, which is most prevalent at the middle of the day, tends to down-regulate is melatonin. And for those of you that are into biology, we know that melatonin is a big component of us going to sleep. So the poor old animal sits in that room for 15 hours a day, and then we turn the lights off, and it will then struggle to go to sleep for probably 3 or 4 hours because its melatonin levels take time to then come back up to normal levels. In addition to that, its gut microbiome is still processing food. So rather than down-regulating and shutting down, which we need to do around the time the sun goes down, because the wavelengths of light tend to trigger a slowing down of our circadian pattern in order to prepare us for sleep. It also has some issues with its gut digesting food when it shouldn't be digesting food. On top of that, we have a range of other photoreceptors on its skin, which trigger interactions with melanin, which is a pigment in our skin that typically is associated with the suntan. And of course, we all know that suntans are bad for us. So whenever we do put the animal out in the sunshine, we smother it in chemicals and make sure that none of that melanin is triggered. Those photoreceptors are triggered by UVA and UVB. In addition, we move it probably from one side of the planet where it evolved for hundreds of thousands of years, and we place it at the equator for a short holiday away from the research project, and put it out in the sun and for long periods of time where it falls asleep in a deck chair and ends up with a massive case of sunburn. And we then take it back home and put it back in the dark again for a period of time. So as you can probably guess by now, that animal is us. And we've been conducting these sorts of experiments for really probably the last at least 140 years since the invention of the electric light. And what I guess I'm proposing is that we've sort of developed this perspective where we think that because we've able to separate ourselves from natural systems through the control of things like light, that all of those things allow us to flourish and actually perform better. And really, perhaps one of the things we're missing in that is that we were fundamentally designed to be in a natural setting. We were designed from an epigenetic perspective to be outdoors. We were designed to see the sun come up in the morning because it triggers certain photoreceptors in the back of our eye and allows us to begin digestion and start to increase our activity levels. Hormones are released. We're designed to see the sun go down at the end of the day because that triggers the increases in things like melatonin, which then allows us to sleep. We're designed to sleep in darkness, or at least with limited UV light, and ultimately with low levels of blue light, high levels of infrared light being heat. And we're designed to eat foods, for example, that come from local geographic areas because they have interactions with sunlight as well that store certain minerals and chemicals in certain substrates in the food, which then interact with our gut microbiome. So flying pineapples from the equator during the middle of winter possibly has some interaction with our gut microbiome based on the fact that the light and the seasonality were different where those pineapples were grown. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of research in there, and I've actually got a list of references at the back for just some of those things I've talked about in terms of light. But I guess what I'm trying to allude to is that humans have always meant to have an ecologically robust pattern of life, and that it's only when we harmonize with those patterns. That doesn't mean we need to spend all our time outdoors, by the way, but when we acknowledge that those patterns are there, that they're natural patterns that have existed for certainly many hundreds of thousands of years, and that we work within the limits of those patterns, that we actually ultimately flourish at our best. Just in the meantime, I mean, doing those things in a way that is regenerative and sustainable for the ecosystem, obviously has benefits directly for us. So there's some great research, for example, that shows that getting at-risk youth to put their hands in the soil, for example, in a revegetation project, starts the process of aligning them with the patterns that exist in nature. So they understand how a plant is propagated, they understand how a plant grows, they start to have to take an awareness for how to sustain that plant. And also there's some biochemical reactions in terms of putting their hands in soil because of the microbiome that exists in there and links to gut health. At the end of that trail, the ... I guess, is that we know that a lot of those things interact at a biological level. So light, as an example, triggers those photoreceptors, which releases hormones, which activates mitochondrial functioning, which then potentially reacts with reactive oxygen species and also endocrine systems to trigger neurotransmitters. In other words, there's a direct biological link with mood. So if we maximize the efficiency of mitochondrial health through a whole range of interactions with natural ecological systems, not just light's just one, then we end up with highly functional mitochondria, which then either downregulates or upregulates our neurotransmitters and our mood as a result of that. So the research that I guess we're starting to look at doing, or I'm looking at doing, is designed to take advantage of the fact that from a dualistic reductionist perspective, there is lots of existing research out there on linking mood and human functioning with nature. So we know that time outdoors in natural settings increases mood. We know it reduces cortisol. We know that it increases all sorts of other biomarkers. Inherent to most of us is the fact that we know that being outside in nature is good. We tend to enjoy it. Most of our social activities and recreations are based around being outdoors. It's not too hard of an argument to make that spending time outdoors is actually a good thing. What I'm arguing is that some of our socio-cultural structures have evolved towards disconnection. So work is now often seen as an indoor pursuit, and it's seen, as only requiring a digital screen. For example, the fact that I'm talking to you via Zoom. And the disadvantage of that is that we haven't really factored in the fact that screens often give off large amounts of blue light, that we often look at our screen many hundreds of times a day. At each time we do that, we trigger small microdosing of those hormones that tell us it's midday. And obviously, if we're doing that right up until bedtime, which most of us do, me included, then there's the potential for us to really start to throw some of those biological systems out of whack. So we need to tackle those socio-cultural structures in as much as we need to, just tell people to get outdoors. So the research itself is investigating how do we reconnect individuals with their ecological self? How do we realign them or ask them to realign themselves with some of those natural patterns? And the assumption is that that needs to be achieved through a socio-cultural lens. We need to get away from perhaps talking directly about thou shalt, but towards, well, why don't you try this? And if there's one thing I learned in the military is that, counterinsurgency warfare or guerrilla warfare is quite effective in leading the horse to water. It's a case of then presenting it in such a palatable way that people will see the most obvious thing that's staring them in the face. So really the research is quite embryonic in that what I'm initially starting to do is to map out all of those individual variables that we know reconnect people to natural systems. So there's obviously the simple things like our senses, the biological processes of smell and touch and taste, light, obviously, as I talked about today. And there's quite a lot of research in that space that already shows that linking people into natural elements triggers positive adaptations in the system through neuroplasticity. So, for example, the smell of the eucalypts and or a pine forest, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, triggers a turpentine sensor in our nose, which releases hormones that tells us it's a certain time of the year. And that starts to interact with our circadian clocks to align us with what needs to be ideally happening as a biological wet bag of cells that we are for us as a species at that time of the year. So we can tap people in and teach them those things. Ironically, a lot of this knowledge is inherent to Indigenous knowledge systems. They often had ways of encoding that sensory data in such a way that it could be passed on either through a songline or certainly in terms of a dreaming, if we're talking about Indigenous Australians. So there's often templates for this in Indigenous knowledge systems that we've disconnected from the longer we've been disconnected from nature. But on top of that, there's all sorts of socio-cultural levers that we can explore in terms of things like rites of passage, heroes' journeys, and other ways of telling the story in a narrative sense. The actual research itself will most likely involve group activity outdoors, and I've talked quite a bit about parkrun as an example. That doesn't mean we'll necessarily work with parkrun, but something ideally that is socially prescribed. So it already has some endorsement from the biomedical model as an example. There's certainly some research coming out of the UK and the US on this concept of green prescription. So getting GPs to prescribe time outdoors. And I think we'd be sort of silly not to take advantage of that as a potential interlinking part of the research. It needs to involve providing participants with some skills in this. How do I reconnect with nature? And I've just said that, a 12-week program of skill building, giving people a range of ways to actually understand what's happening for them from a biological sense and an opportunity to rehearse that. And then, of course, it needs to have a metric around it. So we need to involve assessing mood and well-being over time to look for those realignments and reconnection with those natural systems actually having a dividend for them as an individual, but also for the community and also potentially for the environment. So revegetation programs, for example, are a great way of achieving two things with the same stone. I've mentioned there intersubjective heuristic research, so looking at more qualitative research rather than just quantitative. One of the disadvantages of quantitative is obviously there's a time metric and we don't know about the dose effects of this sort of stuff yet. We can assume that it's probably, from a neuroplasticity perspective, takes quite some time, but how long's a piece of string? And unfortunately, a PhD fits into a limited time period, so we have to try and use a mixed methods sort of approach to capture both qualitative and quantitative outcomes. Lots of references. This is a growing field. It's certainly quite big in the US and the UK. As I say, in Australia, I think there's huge scope for bringing in these sorts of programs from a socio-cultural perspective. And if only because we also have those great Indigenous knowledge sets, which, we've given permission, we've got some templates that are still in existence and still functional today from a bioregional perspective that we could tap into as well. Thanks for that. I know we wanted to have some time for questions, and hopefully Darren will answer some of them as well. But I'm not sure if we hand back to you, Darren, or to Christy to facilitate some questions if there are any.
I think I'm happy to take that. Thank you very much, Mark. That was awesome. Really cool. All right, questions. Any from in the room or online? If you're online, just feel free to unmute yourself and go for it.
Hopefully they're all running for the outdoors.
Yeah, that's right. All right, we've got a question in the room here.
I'm Manos from nursing department. Just a general questions regarding the disturbance of the ecology that you are talking about. So are you suggesting that, for example, now that we have got 4 seasons, for example, most of the countries, we have this advantage that in winter time, that's a very simple example. In winter time, we can have cherries, which is the summer food. If we have that fruit in different environment, is that going to affect our health? Is it in a good way or a bad way, or hasn't got any effect?
Mark, I don't know if you caught the question. You heard
was it eating cherries in winter? Is that bad for us?
Yeah, so that seasonal aspect of fruit consumption or food consumption. Can you comment more on the link between?
Yeah, look, the research is very embryonic and it's mostly trending as opposed to causational or correlational even really at this stage. But the theory, I guess, is that we have a circadian, each of our cells in our body has a circadian clock, right? So we not only do we know what a 24-hour cycle is, but as an ecological being, we know what a 365-day cycle is. Our body adapts over time, primarily based on light. So as the days lengthen in winter, different hormones are released, both from a purely biological functioning perspective, but also from a neurotransmitter perspective. So we function different in winter than we do in summer. And there is clearly some links between our microbiome, so our gut health, and neurotransmitters. So they estimate now that something like 25% of our neurotransmitters are actually generated through our gut, breaking down things into hormones. So one of the things that we're now sort of starting to think is, well, if we're eating cherries in winter, what's that doing for that system? What signals is it sending? It's probably sending some signals at a level that are saying it's summer. So from a 365-day circadian rhythm perspective, on one hand, you've got the light from the sun telling you that the days are long. I should be preparing to hibernate or to slow down, sleep much longer during winter than I do during summer. And then my gut microbiome is sending me different messages. So the truth is we don't know what impact that has at a chronic level over the course of years. What we can say is that clearly the evidence is starting to point towards a lot of our health impacts being impacted by gut health and these sorts of chronic lifestyle issues. So the logical answer seems to be, ideally, you eat a seasonal diet that matches the geography of where you're at. To the point where we now suspect that even some of the DNA research, particularly mitochondrial DNA, which comes primarily from not primarily, entirely from our mother, if you look at the haplogroup for mitochondrial DNA and where that comes from historically, that can influence your health quite. So if you're eating, and we talk about a Mediterranean diet, for example, why is that good for us? Well, probably because a lot of our DNA comes from the Mediterranean if you're a person that looks like me. Yeah, so we know that there are epigenetic switches for these things that are linked in with DNA, and the pieces of the puzzle seem to start to line up. So the more we see those pieces lining up, the more it kind of becomes commonsensical to say, well, I should be eating a diet that A, matches where I come from, and B, matches the seasons that I'm in. So I might eat a Mediterranean diet, but based on an Australian time zone, if that makes any sense. Yeah, so I don't eat a Mediterranean diet based on a Northern Hemisphere Mediterranean diet. I might eat it on an Australian Southern Hemisphere diet. So, there's lots of pieces of that puzzle that need to be fleshed out and research that needs to be undone yet. But you can see where the trends are all starting to point towards some obvious no-brainers.
Yeah, I really like that. And obviously there's the ecological aspect of, not having to transport these products and all the rest of the ecological cost. Very good. Any other questions? You all look contemplative. That's good.
Hopefully not stunned silence. Or
You have any questions online?
Just a comment, Mark. It's Kerry Lee Krause here. And Darren, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mark, I just found that fascinating. I've made a comment in the chat, and I can't wait to learn more about your methodology as much as anything. So the only question, Darren, is when do we hear the update? And it's a bit tongue in cheek in one sense, but it is so topical. And the work that the sanitarium health food company is also doing around the gut microbiome. I am no expert on this, but I'm fascinated from what I do read. So I think you'll make a really significant contribution to the field. And maybe it is a question, Darren, on what are your thoughts about a progress report on this as we go in terms of methodology? I'm really interested in that.
Yeah, and look, I think you'll definitely hear many progress reports. I think I felt a bit bad asking Mark to do this so early, but it's such a fascinating topic, and so yeah, there'll be plenty of opportunities for him to share his work. I think for me, look, it's this whole ecological self. It's a paradigm shift, and I like Mark's idea that we don't stop at the outskirts of our skin. We are part of nature. And I think that adopting that, and championing that kind of paradigm, that's a new way forward and much needed one. So yeah, there'll be plenty of updates. Don't you worry.
And the only other comment, Mark, is my husband was born in Tamanik, beautiful part of the world. So I can just imagine you there on a rainy Tuesday afternoon.
Well, it's a beautiful time in spring. The wildflowers are out. And so, it's quite uplifting to be outside, even though it might be overcast and dreary. There's sunshine coming from the ground up. We've got a lot of golden sticky everlastings that have just flowered, and the tiger orchids are out as well. So there's plenty to be seen.
Beautiful.
Very good. So Maria.
Darren, just a quick one, and Mark, I just want to say congratulations to Mark for the great research that you're doing and the presentation today. And thanks to Darren, Mel and Jason for being such great supervisors and super team. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Maria, for persisting over that long process of getting me through the front door.
Yeah, I'll reiterate that. Yeah, thanks so much, Maria. You're amazing what you do, the support you provide. So that brings us to a conclusion. Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. Really is very stimulating, and I hope that's given you some good things to go away and reflect on. Thanks for joining us online for those who couldn't make it in person, and for those in the room, really nice to have you here. And there's food for you. You get rewarded. Yay. Everyone else will say, good for you. But yeah, really nice to have you on board. And until next time, we'll see you then.